little more prepared now. I'm happy to introduce as respondents Mark Sermon coming from Mozilla Foundation. Is Nagla here? Okay, great. Risk coming from the Access to Knowledge Development Center at American University in Cairo. And then Lionel Brossi coming from University of Chile. Great, yes, so I will sit over here. They each are going to go through a few moments of response. I believe you have microphones next to you. Mark, do you want to?
Okay, hello all. It's a pleasure to be here. I took some notes because it helps to put in order my neural network. So my response, I would like to connect my response with two of the key dimensions of AI and inclusion that Anaf mentioned, and they are to develop knowledge and to debias data and algorithms. When we talk about artificial intelligence and inclusion, how do we position ourselves within the notion of inclusion? We have here an amazing range of human diversity, and I'm sure that if I ask you what is your idea of inclusion, you will probably come up with a lot of different answers. So the question is, what is the common ground where we can start from? Inclusion is a complex notion, but I think the idea of expectations gap can give us a clue. It refers to the imbalance between the existence of material and symbolic resources and expectations and possibilities to have access to them. So, to understand what is the expectation gaps in different contexts, we need first to talk to people, to dedicate time and to hear people, especially those subjects and communities that come from underserved populations or are or were traditionally marginalized. And also work with organizations who represent these communities and these subjects, and they have the knowledge of how to tackle the inequities within their communities. So, to the question of how can we start working to reduce or eliminate the potential discriminatory or unethical outcomes and different forms of exclusion that may arise from AI systems, from my point of view, the answer is to put people and diversity in the middle of all the discussion, in the center of all the discussions. I think we are in a moment that we still have some time to make positive changes, but if we don't pay attention to people and to diversity, we are probably in the wrong track. To me, this is the entry point to think of actionable steps to advance in the development of a more inclusive and more equitable AI systems. Just to give an example from my experience in Conectados al Sur that Ezequiel briefly mentioned today, we have been developing workshops all around Latin America, and we realize, against our expectations, that youth has a lot to talk about artificial intelligence. And actually, youth will be the community that will have the biggest impact in their life with AI systems. So, the problem is the voices of youth is not being included in the processes of design and creation of artificial intelligence systems. So we can develop knowledge, like the first dimension that I mentioned, by co-designing with subjects and communities. And the second dimension is that we can debias data and AI outcomes, paying attention to people and situated contexts with their own particularities. I think this is the way that we can have a chance to develop AI systems to help us to reduce inequalities, and I wish and I hope to achieve a better world. Thank you.
So the unfortunate part of not arriving earlier, you weren't in the debating of the order.
Yes.
And then we drew your straw and you get to go last.
Fine. I made it, yes.
Okay, so I think I was going to go and then you were going to go. This is us. We had, the four of us at breakfast, but then
I had
you
a
didn't
hotel
make it.
incident, so that's
Welcome.
why I made it.
So I think I'm going to go and then your stuff really builds well. So, building on both of these, I think what's exciting about you making the link between the technical and the social and the inclusion and work you guys are doing, and even this whole thing, is we're having a debate we weren't having 2 years ago about, what is AI going to mean in terms of what it is to be human and how our societies work. And one dimension of it that gets talked about a lot and is in these cases is the sort of impact on us as individuals or how the system and us interact. And so in some ways, sort of inclusion and human-computer interaction. The piece I want to throw in is how we think about inclusion from a much broader level of the political economy of the digital society. And so who has power, who doesn't have power, who extracts value, who has a value extracted from them, and who benefits and who doesn't. So I think we want to also add that dimension in. And I want to just quickly go to 3 points that build, especially on sort of where machine learning is in the story. And one point is very much about the current political economy and who has power. I think we know that mostly that's Silicon Valley, what that's going to mean for AI and how that will shape power going forward, and then what we might do about it. So just quickly, on the first point, who has power now? If we can get there, there's a couple slides we were going to point to. Can we get them up there? Let's see. In the meantime, I will do the alternate version of the slides, which I can do using all of you as the audience. So how many people here, we already kind of saw up there, how many people here work for Google or Facebook or Amazon? Not very, okay, good, welcome. How many people here live in Silicon Valley or Seattle or one of those other places? Okay, very few. How many people here on a every day use, as a part of their work or their social life, a product by Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple? And so, and how many people are not from North America or Europe? So that, I was going to show a map, but it was basically that map. Is the current political economy of information is that a very small number of companies, a very small number of geographies make all of the apps, make all of the digital world, control how they're designed, where they go, and the rest of the world ends up using them and ends up having value extracted from them. Certainly, we've looked at money trade flows both in advertising and apps, and they look pretty much like a colonial map of the world, except for Palo Alto is where London is, or if you go back further in history, where Rome was. And so, it's important to start from that spot, right? To understand that it's not that the people who started these companies, because Mozilla works with lots of them, started out necessarily to rule the world, although Peter Thiel maybe is the exception. But and Elon Musk, it's a funny question. But they have actually formed these large-scale monopolies that have come with network effects and really mean they govern how the digital world works. And so we have a very small set of imperial centers governing how the digital world works. So why does that matter for AI and how AI is going to work out? Well, machine learning is probably the biggest example. The network effects that have created these monopolies of the digital economy are also the things that are creating the machine learning databases that will be and are most meaningful at this point. So the fact that search or shopping or any of the other examples that you put up there are early, mainstream, everyday uses of AI is no accident, because those are the things that we create data about. Our data is extracted from us every day that then allow those companies to further extract monetary value through ad targeting, through how we do Uber rides, through how we do online, online shopping. And so really, who's going to control the AIs, but also how the AIs get shaped. I mean, effectively, one of the biggest shapers of the AIs right now is deepening the surveillance-based advertising economy. So like what the AIs are for and who controls them is going to reflect this fairly colonial system of how we organize a digital society, unless we decide to do something different about it. And of course, there is an exception, which is China, which has its own thing and basically has its own internet, but the same thing is going on there, where the people who have the big data, whether that is government-supported researchers having access to commercial data or the Chinese commercial players, are the ones who are getting ahead in AI. And China, interestingly, if you look at number of peer-reviewed articles, Mentioning machine learning or deep learning, China has just surpassed the US in number of academic publications. And so there is an arms race between the two internets, effectively, in terms of who will win in AI. So I think that's important to think about everything about what is the political economy and who's included and excluded, because you'll notice that I haven't mentioned almost the rest of the world. And so that becomes the next question I think you're going to talk about, so I won't go deeply on that. But one of the things I think a group like this, and certainly Mozilla, thinks about a lot is, what can the people who aren't at the center of those decisions and who are amassing that power do to shape where AI goes or where the digital society goes and who's included? And I think that's a great conversation to dig into in fora like this. And there are practical ideas, which is, maybe even those smaller players who aren't Google or Facebook or Amazon, we could build massive co-ops of machine learning training data. Like, that's actually a possibility. Think about a peer-to-peer approach to actually having the people win on AI. Things like that are possible. Look at how we have different kinds of regulations that might counterbalance the companies. And I think increasingly it's impossible for me to imagine us winning without also imagining that citizen power and some massive social movement on the scale of the environmental movement or the peace movement from the 80s or the civil rights movement. Without that, I think we actually won't rebalance the power and make sure that we are all included. So a few things to talk about.
Thank you. Nagla?
Thank you very much. I apologize for not showing up. I had some arrival issues, but I'm settled now and I made it, so thank you for including me. I pick up from where you left. I think the narrative of the political economy of AI is not new. We already are aware of the narrative that regarding digital technologies, the internet, the power of the big players as opposed to the small players. Only now the issue is perhaps, while it's similar, it's perhaps amplified because of the fascinating capabilities of those technologies. So issues related to skill-based technological change, the future of work, the inequality in pay, just looking at the slide that you had, Ansaf, on the learners by age is very much telling about the future of who is it that are going to be the players in this field. But really the issue here is, while the threat has always been there, the threat could always be turned into an opportunity, and this is why we're here. How can we flip the argument? How can we turn things around and use those technologies for the very purpose of inclusion, democratizing, as opposed to leading to inequality? The one new variable is that the global context is different. I mean, we live in a world where there is always a threat of terrorism, radicalization of youth, displaced communities, AI in weapons now, I'm reading about that. So for me, this is a new variable that's perhaps becoming even more amplified than the discussion earlier about the internet, the digital technologies and their impact. So let's talk a little bit about AI for development. Context matters, where we all come from. We come in many parts of the developing world. We have weak institutions, informal economies. We have increasing populations. We have youth bulges in many parts of the world. Mine, for sure, I come from Egypt. We have pockets of poverty, refugee crises and displaced communities. We have authoritarian regimes, and I'm going to edit a bit since this is going on record, but I'm happy to say more in the discussions offline. We have, in some cases, failing states, and we have radicalization of youth. So against all this, there is always an opportunity. There is a context of expanding internet usage, mobile phones becoming, smartphones becoming cheaper, and at the same time, waves of entrepreneurship and innovation in our youth that are trying to make a change, and potential of leapfrogging to utilize the fantastic power of these technologies. So if I may talk a little bit about knowledge creation. Again, part of the debate on the digital technologies, the internet and development was centered around ICT use versus ICT production. And I think of AI use versus the production. And there is knowledge to be gained in both. Your course is wonderful. And I think when I think of my part of the world, I think of communities, I think of cafes, I think of schools, I think of perhaps working very strongly with the civil society to engage in localized content that's emanating from the ground to solve local context-specific issues, the way innovation happens in developing countries. I also think of learning as far as the using, adapting or applications of AI, learning by doing, maybe hackathons, maybe sharing experiences. I'll give you just a few examples. From Egypt, in Egypt, for example, our system of education, school education, is not the best. So we do have a culture of private lessons, and families spend a lot of money on private lessons. So thinking of alternatives that are offered through tablets, through smart technologies, that could actually provide an alternative for learning rather than the informal, expensive format that is already there. In transport, for example, AI for transport. Very interestingly, we have, maybe here in Brazil as well, jaywalking. We have a lot of accidents that take place because of jaywalking on high roads. So we need to think outside the box for local specific, for context specific issues that could be solved by AI applications. I just read about an AI application for refugees in Lebanon that helps psychological stress. Helps, and people, there is a stigma about talking to a therapist, but people can talk to a machine. So there are, small pockets of knowledge, development of applications and knowledge and growing communities using and working with AI applications that could actually benefit tremendously. In our work at the Access to Knowledge for Development Center, we have a data for development program in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and we are actually working with researchers at Birzeit University in Palestine in developing courses on data science in localized context. Of course, comes to mind open source technologies as an enabler for the access and sharing and developing knowledge. I'll talk a little bit about also data, debiasing data, because again, parts of the geographical bias would be very relevant in developing countries, the gender, data, gender segregated data. And again, the key here would be grounds up data collection from the ground, from the field, and sort of as a step towards AI applications. One of the things, again, investment in technology is part of the story. It's very important to, again, invest in the enabling environment, the rest of the story. The productivity paradox related to IT and productivity in the late 90s, in attempts to resolve that, a lot of literature looked at the question of delay in, the idea of investing in organizational changes, in human capital and human skills, in the legal, legislative infrastructure, and all of these. For example, we do have an AI application that was very successful by one of our graduates that ended up as a startup in the US. This is old economy challenges. This is what the World Bank calls analog challenges, because it's basically the environment surrounding entrepreneurship and SME development. So that would end up in a brain drain phenomenon. I'm conscious of time, so I have a lot to say, but we can carry this further in the discussion. I guess what I'm trying to reach is that the narrative is not new, but we need to have a consciousness of what AI can do and how. We need to have concerted efforts of academia, civil society, governments, industry, entrepreneurs, communities, with awareness of the SDGs, the digital divide, and the tremendous impact for this to be amplified, but also how to harness the power of these technologies so we do not romanticize, we do not demonize, but perhaps use it to democratize, equalize, and perhaps humanize. So I invite you to think of a discourse of AI for I. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. So now I'm afraid we are a little tight on time, but be ready with questions. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience. I'm going to take a prerogative and ask a question, though, of all of you, which is actually I want to push a little bit on this idea of debiasing data as that being a sufficient goal in and of itself. And then actually frame that where you started your talk with the idea of translation, and that this was a goal of early artificial intelligence. Translation, sort of channeling things, optimizing things. I think that AI is all about optimizing certain variables. And so if you think about debiasing data sets, it also needs to be about how those data sets will be used. That is, what values are you optimizing a system for? Because that will still introduce different kinds of bias. And so sort of speaking to the digital colonialism aspect that is currently playing out, I feel like a lot of these systems are designed along sort of American Protestant values, particularly around exploitation of capital. And so I'm wondering if you all could say a bit about what you imagine other values or other points of optimization might be when you think about the potential of AI based from your perspective and your context. I know it's a tough question, but I think this idea of optimization is central.
I can try. Is this still working? Okay, I can try. All right, so in terms of debiasing, I think there could be debiasing at two levels. The first level is sanitizing data, right? So you got data, we suppose in machine learning that data is a snapshot that's correct, that's clean, and that's unbiased. Reality is not, right? So sanitizing data could be some effort that could be done, and that actually some research community started looking at. How can we balance the data back? How can we debias when we have features or variables related to gender or things like that? So there could be also debiasing of the models themselves rather than debiasing the data. So how to include a piece in the deep learning algorithm so as we correct that bias. And this is something that's not achieved yet. So this is my take on that question.
I look forward to discussing more. Does anyone else want to take it up?
So, I mean, I guess I would say implicit in your question, debiasing is not enough. I think that's the first conversation we've really started to see grow in the last couple of years. And it can be helpful in terms of taking bias out of systems. Computers can be objective in certain ways or in certain settings. But I think ultimately the bigger questions are these questions about power and then the values behind the people who design the systems or own the systems or whatever. Part of that I think is Western and Protestant, but the Chinese are not Western or Protestant, and certainly I think are bringing a different set of values, as are other actors coming to the table, and the Russians are certainly investing a lot in AI as well and trying to catch up. You heard Putin talking about it a couple of weeks ago. So, but I do think the dominant values emerging in what AI becomes are either Western capitalist or about control economies, or actually a lot about how to grab power globally and about warfare. And so the question is, can we imagine values built into the nature of our AI systems, which, we can also debias at this level. Lots of good intent behind most of these systems, but those are values with growing dominance. And to me, yes, we can imagine different values, whether they're cooperativism or values that are from societies that aren't at the center of those power, or that values from communities that you talked about that are excluded. The big question, so we should spend some time here imagining them. The big question is actually, how do you make them real? So in the face of who designs these systems, we're not going to just by calling for something nice get a different set of values. We have to either use what worked in one era of the internet, which is to build systems that will counterbalance and disrupt that set of values, or find places that themselves have a different enough set of interests that they can use legislation or use citizen power or something. But we actually have to find a way to a different set of values. I think as a more tricky question of what those values might be.
I think it's a chicken and egg.
Well, we have 3 days to talk about the chicken and the egg.
We do.
Maybe something that I mentioned in a talk on AI at Bergman Center at the Law School at Harvard, that this is taken from the cognitive psychology, and it says that most of the systems are generated by weird people. But weird means Western, educated, from industrialized, rich, and developed countries. So maybe it's to learn how to get out of that box, or to try to make an effort to get out of that box, and maybe we can gain some more new values to develop AI systems.
One of the things actually, it's openness. I think open data is very important because again, in some parts of the world, data that comes from top down from statistical offices are very much politicized. So now that there are the new technologies and the sensors, the concept of collecting data ourselves, ground up, using the new technologies could actually serve to layer, and we layer the data to sort of try to be as accurate and present the reality for what it really is. And then if this can be offered as open data, then this can be shared and could be actually used and benefited by everyone.
I'm being told we have no time. So,
Maybe let's take 2 questions.
2 questions, okay, good, I was hoping so. Can you, all the way in the back? Yes, you.
Thank you very much. Alex Gakuru, Code IP Trust in Kenya. I want to make a statement and I want to see responses from the panel that there is no denying that AI is an engineering marvel. It is absolutely mind-blowing engineering invention. But unfortunately, AI is inherently biased, architecturally exclusivist, and a control instrument, and worst of all, it's private property. Is that statement true or false? Yes or no?
Let's take both questions at the same time, and then we'll have a few minutes to respond.
Hello. I'm Daniel Schwabe. I'm a professor at the Catholic University here in Rio, computer science. I'd like to reinforce that point and make a statement. I think there is no such thing as unbiased. I think it's always biased, so perhaps the goal should be, the best we can hope, is to make it explicit in terms of values. So when you publish some data or use some data, to make it clear what are the values that have been put into producing and consuming that information. And perhaps that can give users a better understanding of what's going on. It's not going to solve it all, but it make it more transparent. And my guess is it's probably the best we can hope for.
Ansaf, maybe you could respond and then we'll close it out.
Okay, these are 2 great questions. My first reaction to the questions in the back is that basically it's true that there was so much excitement about what AI can do without really thinking about these kind of questions. But today we know that AI is biased. We know that this kind of systems can be exclusive. That's true. But I think also that we can't stop progress with AI. So how about taking this as an opportunity to remove bias, right? So it's idealistic, but this is an opportunity for humanity to work on building an unbiased world. So, and research will continue on that. So there is obviously a big interest in AI. We discovered that it's not perfect, but we're working toward, people as a community are working toward fixing it. So that's good.
Yeah, no, that's great. So okay, I'm getting the okay from Sandra. I think that was a great way to sort of end the first keynote, the first panel. Thank you, Ansaf. Thank you to the panel, and thank you, Sandra.